last Sunday, right before church started, my 11-year-old Olivia asked me what I was going to be talking about. And I said, communication. And then she goes, what are you going to talk about next week? And I said, oh, Olivia, I'm going to talk about sex. And then she looks up at me and she says, do I have to come? She was really hoping that they could be in Fort Collins this weekend for Cora's soccer game, but that got canceled due to the weather. She has chosen to help out Cora in the nursery today and be a part of that because she didn't quite want to hear this message. We're talking about today, love, sex, and marriage, the S word. Last week, we had a wonderful celebration with confirmation. It was a wonderful class. Absolutely wonderful class. And this class was no different than all the other classes that I have had the opportunity to work with throughout the years. Each class is unique, and there's always something that stands out with each one. I think with each class, we always have an interesting discussion about Jesus. And I still remember we go through the creeds and we talk about how Jesus is fully human and fully divine. And we ask the kids to go up to the chalkboard or to the board and list up all the things that Jesus is fully human and all the things that Jesus is fully divine. And always the fully divine one is always twice as long. And I still remember one class, I don't remember which one it was, but there was one class we were talking about that list of Jesus being fully human. And I said, do you think Jesus went to the bathroom? And this one confirmant said, no way! And I said, but Jesus slept, Jesus got hungry, Jesus ate. I even shared with them a great children's book that we have for our kids called Everyone's Poops. The idea is that everyone eats, so everyone poops. And shared with them the book, and they said, but Jesus didn't do that. Now, I shouldn't blame the confirmands. I mean, they're learning, they're exploring, they're understanding their faith, they're expanding on what they learned as children. I remember one time with one class, we were talking about the official stance of the United Methodist Church, called the social principles. In there, if you go through those, you can find statements about gambling and climate change. In fact, gambling, if you want to know where Lauren gets his statement on gambling, you read the social principles. And yes, there is a statement in there about sex. I still remember we were talking about this, and I had this one confirmand. She could not say the S word. Now, if we would have been in school, if we would have been at her house, or we would have been outside, not a problem. I think she would have said the word sex, but while we were in the church building, she could not say the S word. When you think about it, the S word is a tough one for us as a church. We are bombarded by this word. It's all around us. TV, radio, billboards, anything connected to the internet. Now, I heard this the other day. I couldn't quite verify it, but I heard this the other day that upwards of 40% of the material on the internet is pornography. Isn't that kind of strange that one of the few places that we feel uncomfortable about talking about sex is in the church? And that's kind of tragic because we've allowed society and the internet to dictate what sex is, what it means. And consequently, sexual intimacy has lost much of its beauty and power and significance for too many people. And that's why it is so important for this lesson to be mentioned and discussed in the church. Because if we don't talk about it, we know that society and the internet will. Love, Sex, Marriage, new sermon series on relationships. A few weeks ago we talked about love, and you notice that there's an insert in your bulletin here. We're asking you to fill out the questionnaire. No names, please. Our idea is that at the end of this sermon series, we're going to put together a booklet of some of the best love advice that is available from you. And then last week, as I shared with that conversation with Olivia, we talked about communication. Love and communication, they're not simple. These are complicated discussions and topics. And the one that we're about to talk about today is the same way. It's complicated. It's not simple. Now, before we go on, I feel like I need to mention a few things. Today's sermon has been rated by the Motion Picture Association as PG, so just to let you know that. Now, we do have a nursery. So if you want to, it would go up to 5 years old. If you want to take your kids up to the nursery, that would be fine. We completely understand. I also need to say that statistics-wise, 5% of Americans are single and happy, or happy and single. Which means that you may never get married, but you have friends and family that do. And so this is information for you to share with them. Half of all Americans are single, either through divorce or never getting married. So everyone is included here. I feel like I need to say that these are lessons, these are biblical lessons that everyone can learn from, and that includes myself. And there's one more thing. As I was working on this message this week, I realized that I would rather talk to my 11-year-old daughter that really doesn't want to talk to me about this than I would to this audience here today. Because Olivia is just one person. And as I look out in this audience, I see teenagers that want to hear about right decisions. I see individuals that have been married all their life. I see adults that are divorced. I see adults that are now remarried. I see adults that have never married. I see adults that are widowed. Your life experience and your stories outpace anything that I could share here today. So I need that conversation with Olivia right now. So, excuse me. As I begin here, let me share with you a couple of stories. And these stories come from Adam Hamilton. Adam, as we talked about, is the pastor of the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection, United Methodist Church in Kansas City. He's authored this book, Love to Stay, Sex, Grace, and Commitment. In fact, it's become the framework of this sermon series. A couple of stories that he shares in this book. Recently, one of our church members sent me the following note. On the way back from a Cub Scout meeting, my grandson innocently said to my son, "Dad, I know babies come from mommy's tummies, but how do they get in there in the first place?" After my son hemmed and hawed for a while, my grandson finally spoke up in disgust. You don't have to make up something, Dad. It's okay if you don't know the answer." And then Adam writes, "Well, most of us know the answer, but sometimes we find it uncomfortable to talk about. When Rebecca, our youngest, was 10, she had been learning where babies come from. She asked me, 'Dad, you and Mom never did that, did you?' I answered, 'How do you think you got here, Becca?' She looked at me with surprise. Then I smiled and told her, 'But don't worry, after you were born, we decided never to do that again.'" Love, sex, marriage. So why the S word in the title here? Well, many of you know that for 3 years I was out of the pulpit. Some say I had a real job. I worked more than just 1 day a week. I was at the bank, credit union. I worked at co-op. I got my business degree at WNCC. It gave me a unique perspective. I was able to listen. And in most of those instances, most of those people didn't know I was a pastor. And I tell you, I heard more about the S word in those situations than I ever did as a pastor. From colleagues and customers and classmates. In our society, there's a sense, there is a belief that in the church, we have to deny what is so intimate about ourselves. We have to lie about who we are. That we have to avoid what is really central to our core. It is interesting that people are more comfortable talking about their weekend escapades or even about their spouse to their coworkers or to complete strangers than they are with the people that are sitting right next to you in the pews. Now remember, most people did not know I was a pastor. I heard some fascinating things about the church and the Bible. I heard people believe that this book right here is full of sexual morality lessons. I heard people say that if they came in the church door, we're going to know instantly what they did this weekend, or that we knew what they did in the past. Probably the best one I heard was, I like to have too much fun and the church won't like it. There's a sense, there's a belief, there's an understanding that they're going to come into these doors and we'll know instantly what they've done. They're going to open the Bible and they're going to go, oh, there, that's me. Oh, that's me. Oh, that's me. But you know, guess what's kind of interesting is the Bible really doesn't say too much about the S word. There is more in the Bible about poverty and justice and righteousness and love and tithing and giving than there is about the S word. Isn't that interesting? There's more about giving back to God than there is about the S word. And the Bible doesn't even address everyone's situation. I mean, it's pretty silent if you're single. The focus in the Bible here is on having children, on procreation. And what about if you are older? Decide to get married and you're well past childbearing age. It doesn't say much there. And when it comes to what we like to call traditional biblical family values, it's really hard to translate those things to what we talk about in the 21st century. Solomon had 700 wives. His father, King David, had an affair, had her husband killed, and then married her as a second wife. He didn't do anything with the first wife. He just added her as his second wife. And then Abraham, he had a wife, Sarah, and a concubine, Hagar. He had children with both. And when it comes to equal rights, well, if you remember the sermon series in Ruth, traditional biblical family values say that a woman is property of first the father, and then the husband, and then the son. And as we learn from Ruth and Naomi, when those three die, the Bible doesn't quite know where they fit into that. Now, I'm not bashing the Bible here. I'm just telling you what it says. But when the Bible does speak about this issue, it is powerful. And for this, Max is going to read us a scripture lesson.
A man should fulfill his duty as a husband, and a woman should fulfill her duty as a wife, and each should satisfy the other's needs. A wife is not the master of her own body, but her husband is. And in the same way, a husband is not the master of his own body, but his wife is. Do not deny yourselves to each other unless you first agree to do so for a while in order to spend your time in prayer, but then resume normal marital relations. In this way, you will be kept from giving in to Satan's temptation because of your lack of self-control.
Thank you. This is a passage about intimacy. And even though the Bible doesn't say a lot about the S word, it does say a lot about what is the most intimate part in someone's life. I'll share a story with you. There's a little boy that was found one of those old family Bibles that was on the outside, it was encrusted with gold, and it was, as he was turning the pages, it was almost kind of brittle. I mean, it was just one of those old Bibles. And as he was thumbing through it, a leaf falls out. Somehow a leaf had got pressed between the pages there. And he picks up that leaf, and he runs to his mom. He says, "Mom, look what I found." And the mom says, "What do we have here?" And the boy pauses for a second and says, "I think it's Adam's suit." Now, I I think we can all agree that the Bible does go a little bit farther than that. What does the Bible say? Well, there's three important things it does say about intimacy. And for this, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning of the Bible, to the first relationship that it mentions, Adam and Eve. And I'm going to share with you from the book of Genesis. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." And then skipping over to chapter 4, "Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord." Well, there's a couple things I hope you heard in that passage. Become one flesh. We're both naked, not ashamed, and new. Clearly, this is a passage about intimacy. Today, I want you to glean, hopefully, three things. I don't want you to go away from this passage thinking, boy, Seth's 11-year-old daughter really didn't want to hear this message. Or, I hope you don't go away and say, the pastor said sex. I hope it's these three things, because it's sprinkled throughout the Bible. First, simple biology. Intimacy is God's way of reproducing human beings. You know, those of you that have children, and I'm including myself there, it is amazing to look at your child and to see how genetics goes from the mom and the dad right into the children. And so as I look at my children, it's indescribable how the role of genetics as it's passed on. And so the Bible is pretty clear about, number one, its reproduction. The second one, very closely related to that, has to do with the word knowledge. And it refers to an intimate knowledge that we have of our partner. Now, it's no surprise here that this is a concept that we find very early in the Bible. Now, the man knew his wife Eve. And we're referring to that word there of knew. The Hebrew word there is yada. And probably the best way to explain yada is when your parents are talking to you about sex and you cover your ears and you go, yada, 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 yada. I'm teasing there, obviously, but there's an interesting piece about that Hebrew word yada. Is it has a close connotation to the word vulnerability, vulnerable. And we find it when yada refers to making a covenant. When we are in a covenant with someone else, we are in a vulnerable situation to the other person. Meaning, we're taking a risk. For example, Abraham made a covenant with God. And to fulfill his side of the covenant, Abraham had to be circumcised as an adult. God, to fulfill the covenant, says, I will make sure that your descendants are as numerous as the stars in the sky. But Abraham, he's taken a huge risk there, being circumcised as an adult to fulfill his side of the covenant. It's the same when two people know each other. We become vulnerable. Completely open, naked before the other. So true intimate knowledge is number two. Now, number three, or the first two, seems to refer to procreation. But number three has nothing to do with childbearing, but has everything to do with intimacy. There are some individuals that are simply not able to have children. And as one who has experienced a few miscarriages, I understand and sympathize with those individuals. I have been with individuals who want to be a parent so bad and I have written letters on their behalf to adoption agencies. In fact, I even had the opportunity to be present with someone. The birth mother came to the baptism ceremony almost as a way of saying, I entrust that you will raise my daughter in a Christian home. And I had an opportunity to be with those parents as they adopted this child. I've also been there in the courtroom as two parents got to adopt some beautiful children. Or there are people like my sister. When she was married, she insisted that there was no way she was going to have a baby. Period. She was not going to have children. And she didn't. She told us, she goes, I don't want that, what's going to happen to my body. She was just about that. So I would say that now that she's divorced, she is probably in that 5% single and happy and single category. So number 3 has to do with an emotional bond between two people. And the word there is, and they became one flesh. And so I like to think of number 3 as like this magical device right here with duct tape. When you think about it, I mean, this stuff is amazing. It's almost like magic. You know, the way it sticks together. I mean, how many of you, headlights, cars, computers, all kinds of things are just, it is absolutely wonderful. And the bond between it is unbelievable. But you start putting it together and then separating it from time to time, and it gets a little bit less sticky. And the bond gets looser and looser. And you just don't have that close of a bond anymore. And I can keep going on, and it will become less and less sticky. So number 3, intimacy in the Bible is like duct tape. An emotional bond between two individuals. And so that's why the S word has spiritual and physical connotations. And you find this message sprinkled throughout the Bible, from Genesis all the way to what Paul tells us today. That's the reason that Paul felt the need to talk to us about Corinth. Paul says your wife's body belongs to the husband, and your husband's body belongs to the wife. Corinth was a port city. In fact, it was well known as a place when soldiers went to receive diversion and entertainment. It is said that there were over 1,000 temple prostitutes to service these sailors. Sexual immorality was rampant. And yet in this city, people were coming to Christ. Some who were married wrote to Paul saying, in essence, we know that the kind of sex is all around us is bad. Does that mean we should not have sex unless we want a baby? Now, I like how Adam Hamilton paraphrases Paul's response. He writes, Paul answers, heavens no. You're supposed to be intimate with each other. It's a blessing from God, and here's what you need to know. Husbands, your body isn't yours. It belongs to your wife. What does she need? A tender touch? A listening ear? Use your body to bless her. Wives, your body belongs to your husband. How can you bless him? What can you do to minister to him? Encourage him, lift him up, and fill him with joy. Intimacy in the biblical sense is beautiful. Yes, it creates a child. Yes, it provides us with an intimate knowledge of our partner. Yes, it bonds us emotionally. It truly is a blessing from God. And it doesn't have to do with sex. As I shared, Adam Hamilton received a lot of his information from a survey that he did with his congregation. He had over 5,000 respondents to his survey on these questions. And I want to conclude today's message with one of those responses. One of her respondents, a woman in her 70s, wrote a note on the survey. The note said health problems made it impossible for the woman and her husband to have intimate relations anymore. but that they had discovered many ways to express physical love. She mentioned hugs and kisses, loving looks and touches. And we flirt with each other all the time, she said. People feel deeply in love without physical sex prior to marriage. And while sex is a joyous part of marriage, it is not the only measure of deep love and sharing. I couldn't have said it any better. Amen. At this time, we wait